I'm delighted to introduce Michael Thomas, Associate Dean in the School of Humanities and Social Sciences and the Director of Monmouth University's Visiting Writers Program.
If by your art, my dearest Father, you have put the wild waters in this roar, allay them. Oh, I have suffered with those I saw suffer. Miranda in Shakespeare's The Tempest urges her father, the maker, the artist, the magician, to put at rest what is wild, chaotic, painful, his own creations. Turn it into peace, she begs. There, in lines of this first act, we have the essence of the artist's role. Also, what is lived by the audience witnessing great art. My students often ask, why great poems break our hearts? Why is it that Dante's Inferno is the most widely read of the three canticles, not Purgatorio, not Paradiso? Many suggest that it is the mystery of grief, but faced with resolution and uncertainty all the same, that makes us read. Antonio Porcia says in an aphorism, "The mystery brings peace to my eyes, not blindness." But I propose, in addition to that, another sentence for our purposes, why I am here today. That we are healed, rejuvenated by the multitudes of emotions we face in literature. That its mysteries comfort. Great poems deliver us to ourselves. They read us, is what Edward Hirsch says. In his book, How to Read a Poem and Fall in Love with Poetry, he writes, "I am grateful that the Iliad opened up a space in me that made it possible to name what I would feel." The overwhelming extremity of Achilles' grief over the death of his friend, which so troubled Plato because of its irrational and excessive nature, was precisely what cried out to me. I loved how unflinching it was. I was wounded by its truth, and I was healed by it. This is precisely my experience reading the work of Natasha Tretheway. More than ever, I believe we need poets like her. In November 2006, Natasha was the featured poet for the Long Branch Poetry Festival. Several months later, she won the Pulitzer Prize. In 2012, when she visited Monmouth again, I said, my guess is that there are other awards on the horizon, and 2 months later, she was named Poet Laureate of the United States. I hope that this means Monmouth University will bring even more good fortune for her. It was yet another reading that proved even more memorable. In 2008, in New York City, at the Associated Writing Programs Conference, when she shared the stage with Robert Pinsky, she read poems from her book, Native Guard. She paused to consider the woman translating her poems in sign language and questioned the reality, the existence of racial slurs, the hateful, racist epithets recorded in her poems, but then turned into sign language. Where do those signs come from? She wondered. This is the mind and heart of a poet who writes exacting and resonant poetry that is rooted in the shadow side of American history, as one reviewer has written. Though our American history with race can be beautiful and enlightening, it remains tragic as the murder of George Floyd a little over a year ago, and many, hundreds and thousands killed before named and unnamed. As marchers walked on Main Street in Asbury Park, a city in which I live, I looked up at a worn, tattered American flag outside our window and heard Allen Ginsberg in my mind. America, when will you be angelic? I believe he offers a prayer there for racial reckoning. Natasha Tretheway's poems expand our capacity to grasp history, however complex and paradoxical. Even with her most deeply personal work, she writes poems, and most recently an incredible new memoir, that are like a treacherous whisper to borrow a phrase from one of her poems. Or perhaps what we come to know is a kind of quiet in the language of blood, quoting her again. Tretheway is the author of 5 collections of poetry: Monument, Thrall, Native Guard, Baloxophilia, and Domestic Work. She is also the author of a book of creative nonfiction, Beyond Katrina, a meditation on the Mississippi Gulf Coast. Most recently, she published a memoir, Memorial Drive, a book that makes a reader feel as much as Memorial Drive does, cannot be written without an absolute mastery of varied modes of discourse, said a reviewer in the New York Times. The Russian playwright Anton Chekhov said, "My holy of holies is the human body, health, intelligence, inspiration, love, talent, and the most absolute freedom imaginable. Freedom from violence and lies, no matter what form the latter two take." Natasha Tretheway is one of the few American poets whose poems have this core aesthetic project. She writes lasting, beautiful, painful, heartbreaking poems, just the kind of feeling I want when I read. It's a kind of shattering that delivers harmonic clarity. She accomplishes this when she takes what is still or static, what is forgotten, repressed, and oppressed, and renders it dynamic and memorable. It is not only writing the unsayable, which is the poet's job, but more so, Natasha is writing us, charging us to make sense of language and of what's inside, and then beyond the shadows, private and public. The recipient of a Mississippi Governor's Award for Excellence in the Arts, Tretheway was named the 2008 Georgia Woman of the Year. She has been inducted into both the Fellowship of Southern Writers and the Georgia Writers Hall of Fame. She has served as Poet Laureate of Mississippi and as the 19th U.S. Poet Laureate. Other honors include the 2016 Academy of American Poets Fellowship. Tretheway is currently the Board of Trustees Professor of English at Northwestern University. It is my true honor to welcome her.
Hello, and thank you for tuning in. I'm going to read today from my memoir, Memorial Drive. It's a book about my mother, her strength, resilience, and powerful love, and the impact my years with her and in the aftermath of her tragic death had on me and my life's journey, becoming a writer. Three weeks after my mother is dead, I dream of her. We walk a rutted path, an oval track around which we are making our slow revolution. Side by side, so close our shoulders nearly touch, neither of us speaking, both of us in our traces. Though I know she is dead, I have a sense of contentment, as if she's only gone someplace else to which I've journeyed to meet her. The world around us is dim, a backdrop of shadows out of which now a man comes. Even in the dream, I know what he has done, and yet I smile, lifting my hand and speaking a greeting as he passes. It's then that my mother turns to me, then that I see it, a hole the size of a quarter in the center of her forehead. From it comes a light so bright, so piercing, that I suffer the kind of momentary blindness brought on by staring at the sun, her face nothing but light ringed in darkness when she speaks. Do you know what it means to have a wound that never heals? I know I'm not meant to answer, and so we walk on as before, rounding the path until we meet him again. This time, he's come to finish what he started. Holding a gun, he is aiming at her head. This time, I think I can save her. Is it enough to throw myself in the bullet's path, shout no? I wake to that single word, my own voice wrenching me from sleep. But it's my mother's voice that remains. Her last question to me, do you know what it means to have a wound that never heals? A refrain. The last image of my mother, but for the photographs taken of her body at the crime scene, is the formal portrait made only a few months before her death. She sat for it in a mass market studio known for its competent but unremarkable pictures. Babies coaxed to laughter by hand puppets, children in stair-step formation wearing matching Christmas sweaters, all of it against a common backdrop. Sometimes it's a sky blue scrim that looks as if it's been brushed with a feather, or an autumn scene of red and yellow leaves framing a post and rail fence. For moodier portraits, as if to convey a sense of seriousness or formal elegance, there's the plain black scrim. She was 40 years old. For the sitting, she'd chosen a long-sleeved black sheath, the high collar open at the throat. She does not look at the camera, her eyes fixed at a point in the distance that seems to be just above my head, making her face as inscrutable as it always was, her high, elegant forehead smooth and unlined, a billboard upon which nothing is written. Nor does she smile, which makes the cleft in her chin more pronounced, her jawline softly squared above her slender neck. She sits perfectly erect without looking forced or uncomfortable. Perhaps she intended to look back on it years later and say, that's where it began, my new life. I'm struck with the thought that this is what she must have meant to do, document herself as a woman come this far, the rest of her life ahead of her. Hindsight makes me see the portrait differently now. How gloomy it is, as if the photographer meant to produce something artistic rather than the ordinary studio portrait. It's as if he made of the negative space around her a frame to foreground some difficult knowledge, the dark past behind her, her face lit toward a future upon which her gaze is fixed. And yet, undeniably, something else is there, elegiac even then, a strange corner of light just behind her head, perhaps the photographer's mistake, appearing as though a doorway has opened, a passage through which, turning, she might soon depart. Looking at it now, with all I know of what was to come, I see what else the photographer has done. He shot her like this, her black dress black as the scrim behind her, so that, but for her face, she is in fact part of that darkness, emerging from it as from the depths of memory. Nearly 30 years after my mother's death, I went back for the first time to the place she was murdered. I'd not been there since the year I turned 19, when I had to clean out her apartment, disposing of everything I could not or would not carry with me. All the furniture and household items, her clothing, her large collection of records. I kept only a few of her books, a heavy belt made of bullets, and a single plant she had loved, a Dieffenbachia. Throughout my childhood, it had been my responsibility to tend it every week, dusting and misting the upper leaves and snipping the browned lower ones. Be careful when you handle it, my mother warned. A small precaution, seemingly unnecessary, but there is a toxin in the sap of the Dieffenbachia. It oozes from the leaves and the stems where they are cut. Dumb cane, the plant is called, because it can cause a temporary inability to speak. Struck dumb, we say, when fear or shock or astonishment renders us mute. Dumb grief, when the grief is not expressed in uttered words. I could not then grasp the inherent metaphor of the plant, my relationship with my mother, what it would mean that she had made its care my duty, while warning me of its danger. When I left Atlanta, vowing never to return, I took with me what I had cultivated all those years, mute avoidance of my past, silence and willed amnesia buried deep in me like a root. Nor could I have anticipated then that anything would ever draw me back to that city, to a geography that held at every turn a reminder of a past I was determined to forget, even as I tried to honor her memory in every way I knew how. Indeed, going back for work after accepting a university faculty position, I thought I could circumvent my former life, going out of my way to avoid the last place I could not bear to see, until I had to. To get there, I had to drive past landmarks that took me back to 1985, the county courthouse where the trials were held, the train station from which my mother traveled downtown to work, the DeKalb County Police Station at the intersection of Highway 285, the bypass loop around Metro Atlanta, and make my way down Memorial Drive, a major east-west artery once named Fair Street. It originates in the middle of the city, Memorial, and winds east from downtown, ending at Stone Mountain, the nation's largest monument to the Confederacy. A lasting metaphor for the white mind of the South, Stone Mountain rises out of the ground like the head of a submerged giant, the nostalgic dream of Southern heroism and gallantry emblazoned on its brow. In bas-relief, the enormous figures of Stonewall Jackson, Robert E. Lee, and Jefferson Davis. Not far from its base is the apartment we lived in that last year at the 5400 block of Memorial, number 18D. Though I knew exactly where it was, knew the landmarks leading up to it, I drove right past it first and had to double back to enter the tree-lined front gate. From there, I could see Stone Mountain in the distance, suddenly visible where Memorial crests, as if to remind me what is remembered here and what is not. The last time I was at the apartment complex, the morning after her death, I could see the faded chalk outline of her body on the pavement, the yellow police tape still stuck to the door, the small round hole in the wall beside her bed where a single bullet, a missed shot, had lodged. Nothing in the landscape today bears evidence to any of that, though everything seems to carry the imprint of loss. Row after row of rusted stair rails and window screens mark the shabby buildings, just a decade old when we moved in, and a lighter shade of paint coats the walls as if to hide the dark history beneath it. I keep an image in my head of myself that from that first day after her death at the apartment. There's a video recording of my arrival made by a local news station. And so the image is not only of those few moments, but of watching myself from a distance, entering my former life for what I thought to be the last time. In the footage, I walk up the stairs to the door and step in, shutting it behind me. When I think of it now, I don't hear any words, the volume on mute. Perhaps the reporter spoke our names, or perhaps she did not, calling my mother victim instead. And in my mind's eye, a caption fills the bottom of the screen. It identifies me as daughter of the murdered woman. Even then, I felt as though I were watching someone else, a young woman on the cusp of her life, adulthood and bereavement gripping her at once. The young woman I'd become, walking out of that apartment hours later, was not the same one who went into it. It's as if she's still there, that girl I was, behind the closed door, locked in the footage where it ends. Often, I've seen that doorway in my dreams. Only now is it a threshold I can cross. I'm going to read now from the first chapter, which is called Another Country. And it begins with an epigraph from Shakespeare's sonnet number 3. Thou art thy mother's glass, and she in thee calls back the lovely April of her prime. Another country. There is a large birthmark on the back of my thigh. Even though it has been with me over half a century, I can't recall which leg bears its dark outline, and so I have to look at myself backward in a mirror to remember. Seeing it is not unlike encountering a forgotten scar, a remnant that recalls the moment of wounding. It takes me back to my early childhood, the long, warm days in Mississippi when I wore shorts much of the time and the birthmark was plainly visible, not hidden as it usually is now. Though not the shape of a hand, it is the size of one, and in exactly the same spot where, if you were told to sit on your hands as my mother was, you might leave a mark. Across cultures, myths abound about the imprint a mother can make even before her child crosses the threshold into the world, the way her desires or fears can be manifest on the body, birthmarks in the shape or color of food she craved, a lock of gray hair where she tugged at her own. To stanch the cravings, they say, eat a bit of dirt or clay. To steady the hand that worries the hair, sit on it. Had my mother done any of this, there might have been a single story in my family about what my birthmark symbolizes. The only thing the elders agreed on was that it looked like a place on a map, somewhere my mother might have dreamed of, but it never been. I've often imagined her anticipating my arrival, both hopeful and anxious about the world, the particular time and place I would enter, a fierce longing taking shape inside her. In the spring of 1966, when I was born, my mother was a couple of months shy of her 22nd birthday. My father was out of town, traveling for work, so she made the short trip from my grandmother's house to Gulfport Memorial Hospital as planned, without him. On her way to the segregated ward, she could not help but take in the tenor of the day, witnessing the barrage of rebel flags lining the streets. Private citizens, lawmakers, Klansmen, often one and the same, raising them in Gulfport and small towns all across Mississippi. The 26th of April that year marked the 100th anniversary of Mississippi's celebration of Confederate Memorial Day, a holiday glorifying the Old South, the lost cause, and white supremacy. And much of the fervor was a display, too, in opposition to recent advancements in the civil rights movement. She could not have missed the paradox of my birth on that particular day, a child of miscegenation and interracial marriage still illegal in Mississippi and in as many as 20 other states. Sequestered on the colored floor, my mother knew the country was changing, but slowly. She had come of age in the summer of 1965, turning 21 in the wake of Bloody Sunday, the Watts riots, and years of racially motivated murders in Mississippi. Unlike my father, who'd grown up a white boy in rural Nova Scotia, hunting and fishing, free to roam the open woods, my mother had come into being a Black girl in the Deep South, hemmed in, bound to a world circumscribed by Jim Crow. Though my father believed in the idea of living dangerously, the necessity of taking risks, my mother had witnessed the necessity of dissembling, the art of making of one's face an inscrutable mask before whites who expected of Blacks a servile deference. In the summer of 1955, when she was 11 years old, she'd seen what could happen to a Black child in Mississippi who had not behaved as expected, stepping outside the confines of racial prescription, in my grandmother's copy of Jet magazine, Emmett Till's Battered Remains, his destroyed face. Even had my mother wanted to ignore the racial violence and increasing turbulence around her, my grandmother would not allow it. In her house, the latest issue of Jet lay on the coffee table beside a book of documentary photographs of the civil rights movement, images ranging from lynchings to peaceful protests and the resilient faces of Black Americans, constant reminders of the necessity of fighting for justice in a state where the external reminders were increasingly unavoidable. The year before my mother met my father, the civil rights activist Medgar Evers had been gunned down in his driveway in Jackson. That year, 1963, my grandmother joined a group of Black citizens in the Biloxi Wade Inn to protest being denied the right to use the public beaches. To mourn Evers, the protesters placed hundreds of Black flags in the sand, an image my mother, watching from the seawall, would not forget. Nor would she forget hearing the news of the 3 civil rights activists working on the Freedom Summer campaign to register Black voters in Mississippi. James Chaney, Andrew Goodman, and Michael Schwerner had been abducted and murdered in June 1964, their bodies found 2 months later, buried under the weight of an earthen berm in Neshoba County. When the news reached her, my mother was out of state on a field trip with her college theater troupe. Back home, the Ku Klux Klan had initiated its campaign of terror, the Mississippi she returned to having grown even more frightening. That summer was a season of fires, of danger coming ever closer, flaming crosses and Black churches burning all around the state. My mother and grandmother, living across the street from a church, slept less soundly then, awakening often in the night to listen. It was against that backdrop of imminence and upheaval that my parents, both college students at the time, fell in love. They met in a literature course on modern drama, and their conversations on books and theater propelled them from the classroom out into the afternoon sunlight as they walked the campus and beyond among the rolling green hills of Kentucky. When they eloped in 1965, traveling across the Ohio River into Cincinnati, where it was legal for them to be married, only my mother fully understood what this might mean for me, the child she was already carrying. In letters to my father during their months apart, she was at once sanguine and practical, hopeful for a changing nation, but also aware that any child she brought into the world would have much to learn in order to be safe. That meant I would need to understand the realities I would face, the painful, oppressive facts of a place slow to accept integration, even as it was now the law of the land. My father, idealistic in nature, was still naive enough to believe I could grow up as free of the burdens of race, of Blackness, that is, as he was. They complemented each other, as opposites do. My mother, graceful and reserved, attentive to details. My father, with his rough manners, rowdy and bookish at once, often distracted by his thoughts. It was my mother who stanched the blood on my cheek when, after watching my father shaving, I tried using his straight razor. It had been my father, absent-minded, who'd left the razor on the counter within my reach. One day, when I cut my knee in the ditch outside, revealing what appeared to be a layer of white skin underneath, I lay between them, holding their hands up side by side, asking why they weren't the same color, why I didn't match either of them exactly. What was I? You have the best of both worlds, they told me, not for the first time. Out in the world, alone with either of them, I was just beginning to feel a profound sense of dislocation. If I was with my father, I measured the polite responses from white people, the way they addressed him as sir or mister, whereas my mother would be called gal, never miss or ma'am, as I'd been taught was proper. So different was the treatment I received with each of them that I was unsure where or how I belonged. Only at home, the three of us together, did I feel profoundly theirs. And in that trinity of mother, father, and child, I would shut my eyes and fall asleep on the high bed between them. When I began to go out with both my parents, outside of the confines of North Gulfport to a store or the movie theater, I watched the ways white people responded to us. That my parents were beautiful would have been reason enough to stare. But in Mississippi in the late 60s and early 70s, it had been only a few years since the beaches were integrated to comply with national law, and the schools were yet to be fully desegregated across the state. Ross Barnett, the former governor, was monitoring interracial activity, and my grandmother had been put on the list of people to watch ever since she tried to place my parents' 1965 wedding announcement in the local newspaper. Separation of the races was still the way of things, maintained by custom, if not upheld by law, and my parents and I met with a great deal of hostility most places we went. I could see it on the faces of the white people we encountered, how even the nicer ones just shook their heads, whispering, "Such a cute little thing. Too bad she's black." How others stared at us, sucking their teeth. Sometimes this hostility turned to outright intimidation, someone following us out of Woolworth's to the car, my mother gripping my father's arm to prevent him turning around and engaging the man behind us, someone else driving slowly by the house, glaring at us as we sat on the front porch, a group of 3 or 4 men accosting my father on his way home from work on the docks, asking, "What's wrong with you? Why you livin' among the niggers?" My mother and grandmother, having lived with this kind of attention, were accustomed to scrutiny and intimidation. A stream of headlights searching the front windows of the house at night, the sexually charged calls from white men driving by in broad daylight. In the late 50s and early 60s, my grandmother had given shelter to several Mennonite missionaries who came to North Gulfport to teach, repair the dilapidated housing of the very poor, and minister to the community. For weeks at a time, these young white missionaries would stay at her house, and it wasn't long before their presence and the work they were doing was noticed by local whites. First, there was a bomb threat directed at the Bible camp where the Mennonites were believed to be promoting integration, the camp my mother attended. Then, the Ku Klux Klan threatened to bomb the Mount Olive Baptist Church across the street. Undeterred, my grandmother began to sleep with a pistol beneath her pillow. In spite of the danger, she was adamant in her belief that she must do this work, must open her doors to help. A moral obligation, she called it. Though my mother and my grandmother met all of this with a similar stoicism, they responded differently. My mother was averse to guns, to confrontation, whereas my grandmother saw guns as a necessity, telling me countless times the way to confront a would-be intruder. "First, fire a warning shot," she said, "and if they keep coming, aim at the legs, shoot to wound." Those words marked my first awareness that any danger we might face was not limited to the world outside our close-knit community, the radius of those houses, but could come right to us, right up into the yard, perhaps even the front door. Though I was too young to recall the night the Klan burned a cross in our driveway, I heard the story again and again, and the night lives in my memory as experience. I see it as though watching a scene in a documentary, silent but for the metal box fan in the window, a whirring sound like an old movie projector. The men arrived late in the evening, long after supper. My parents still sitting together in the den, watching television, my grandmother and my Uncle Charlie in the kitchen, washing the last of the dishes. All of them dead now. I see them moving through the house like ghosts. Even I am a ghost in this story, an infant self of whom I have no recollection, my inscrutable face still white as my father's. My grandmother peers through the blinds at the group of men, 7 or 8 in white robes carrying a man-sized cross. In the bedroom, my mother watches over me, the blackout curtains drawn, all the lights in the house extinguished so that, but for the faint glow of a hurricane lamp in the corner, we are all in darkness, my father and uncle, rifles in hand, waiting silently in the front room as, outside, the fire ignites. One of the few photographs I have of the three of us together is a formal portrait taken in 1969 in my grandmother's den. It was the last photograph we'd take together as a family. My father sitting on a wooden armchair, my mother balanced on the arm, her long legs crossed, and me between them, puckish in a green dress. I see in that photograph now my grandmother's desire for commemoration. Most pictures we had were snapshots taken casually, but for this one, my grandmother had called in a photographer. 2 years after the Supreme Court had ruled in Loving v. Virginia that laws prohibiting interracial marriage were unconstitutional, it was as if she wanted the formality of a professional portrait to make visible the legitimacy of my parents' union, our family, in a place where we were still seen as an aberration. The photographer who came to take the portrait was a double amputee. Though my mother warned me not to stare at him, I could not resist finding a way to steal glances at the space just below his knees where his shins would have been. When he scratched the air around one of the missing limbs, I was watching him with such intense curiosity that he caught me. He must have been accustomed to the rough curiosity of children. Leaning toward me, he spoke barely above a whisper. "I can still feel it," he said, "even though it's gone." In the photograph, you can see my mother pressing my arm with her forefinger as if to make visible her imprint on me. I am looking directly at the photographer toward a new idea of absence, of phantom ache, knowing nothing about how potently one might come to feel it. My father had a different kind of commemoration in mind. In the aftermath of the Loving decision, he'd wanted to take a trip someplace where our color differences might be less noticeable, where my mother might be able to relax. Ignoring her qualms about the dangers of a long journey, over 1,000 miles, my father bought a used Lincoln Continental to get us to Mexico. I have a vague recollection of the seemingly endless stretch of blacktop, how that long car seemed to float above it as I dozed on the back seat. The sun hung low and heavy as we drove toward it. We were still 3 years from the end of their marriage, but the best of our days together already lay behind us in the darkening distance. What has stayed with me vividly from that trip, inscribed in the way that traumatic events draw a map of connections in the brain, is my near drowning in the hotel pool. My father was always reading, and so I imagine he must have gone inside to retrieve a book, leaving my mother poolside as I splashed in the shallow end. I don't recall how I ended up in the deeper section. For what seemed like a long moment, I was suspended there, looking up through a ceiling of water, the high sun barely visible overhead. I don't recall being afraid as I sank, only that I was enthralled by what I could see through that strange and wavering lens. My mother, who could not swim, leaning over the edge, arms outstretched, reaching for me. She was in the line of the sun, and what she did not block radiated around her head, her face like an annular eclipse, dark and ringed with light. One of the last photographs from that time is a picture with me and my mother, taken a year before we left Mississippi. Perhaps my father is there, behind the camera. Perhaps he is not. In the picture, my mother and I are both dressed in purple, her paisley dress, my velvet frock. She's just begun to wear her hair in an afro, a reddish corona around her head. We are in the living room at my grandmother's house, and she is seated on a large upholstered chair. I am standing close, leaning into her shoulder, our faces nearly touching. Tilting her head, she looks at me adoringly, and I am smiling, demure, casting my eyes away from her. A heart locket dangles from the collar of my dress. The shape of your face, she'd say, cradling my face in her hands. There's a flaw in the picture, a white spot at the center of her face from which she already seems to be disappearing. If you were to multiply that spot, double its size every year for 12 years, beginning with our arrival in Atlanta, by the end of that time, she'd be completely gone. Only the space where she had been would remain, a hole like the shape of her afro or the sun. Thank you.